The cake had 3 tiers and white roses made of sugar frosting. I know because I was seated close enough to the dessert table to count every petal. What I wasn't close enough to do was see my brother's face when he said his vows. There was a column between us. A thick, white-painted wooden column, the kind you find in old resort ballrooms that the owners keep because they think it adds character. From where I sat, all I could see was the back of it, and beyond that, the back of 3 strangers' heads, and beyond that, nothing. That wasn't the most humiliating part, though. I want to be honest about that up front, because if I started this story at the worst moment, you wouldn't believe the rest of it. Let me back up. My brother Colin is 3 years younger than me and has always been, in our family's language, the easy one. That was the word they used. Easy. He graduated on time, stayed local, dated someone from our hometown, built a good life in the way our father understood, steadily, quietly, without complication. He coached youth basketball on weekends. He remembered birthdays. He called our parents on Sunday evenings without being asked. I was not the easy one. I joined the army at 22, 6 months after finishing my engineering degree, because I needed to do something that felt like it had actual stakes. My father thought I was running away from something. He may have been partially right, but I was also running towards something, and I don't think he ever understood that difference. I did 2 deployments. I came back with a promotion to captain, a scar on my left forearm I never fully explain, and a way of moving through the world that my mother once described, not unkindly, as like you're always waiting for something to go wrong. I wasn't offended. She wasn't wrong. Between deployments and afterward, I worked in logistics and infrastructure assessment, the kind of work that doesn't make sense to explain at holiday dinners, so I stopped trying. When relatives asked what I did, I said I worked for the military, and they nodded and changed the subject to Colin's new truck or the kitchen renovation my parents were planning. Conversations at our family table, in my memory, are mostly about Colin, not because anyone was cruel about it. They weren't. It was more like water finding the path of least resistance. Colin's life was easy to talk about. It came with recognizable milestones and clean narratives. Mine came with acronyms and classified footnotes and long silences over things I couldn't share, so I became the outline version of myself at family gatherings. Present. Quiet. Taking up appropriate space, but not much of it. When Colin got engaged to a woman named Beth, sweet, warm, the kind of person who sends handwritten thank you cards, I was genuinely happy for him. I flew home for the engagement party. I gave a toast that made people laugh and then tear up a little, which I was proud of, because that's a hard balance to strike. My father shook Colin's hand and pulled him into a hug, and my mother cried, and it was exactly the kind of moment families are supposed to have. I drove back to the airport the next morning and didn't hear from them for 6 weeks. I wasn't angry. That's the thing I want to be careful to say correctly. I wasn't angry. I had grown used to a particular kind of invisibility inside my own family, the way you grow used to a draft in a room you live in long enough. You stop expecting the window to close. You just dress warmer. The wedding was held at a resort about 2 hours from my hometown. One of those places with a long driveway and white fences and the kind of grounds that photograph beautifully. I arrived the morning of, having driven up the night before and stayed at a motel down the road because the room block was full by the time I tried to book. I didn't say anything about that to anyone. I wore my dress uniform. I know some people think that's a statement, wearing the uniform to a civilian event, but for me it wasn't. I had one formal option with me because I travel light. That was it. I found the seating chart posted near the ballroom entrance. Long white board, printed cards in small gold frames. I ran my finger down the columns and found my name near the bottom of the list, assigned to table 11. I followed the numbering into the ballroom and found table 11 tucked against the far wall, partially behind one of those white columns, angled in a way that made it clear it had been added as an afterthought when the head count exceeded the original plan. There were 3 other people at the table already. A couple who turned out to be co-workers of Beth's from a previous job, and an older man who said he was a distant relative of someone from the venue's catering staff who'd been given a courtesy seat. We were, in the most specific sense possible, the table of people who hadn't quite fit anywhere else. I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. I looked at the back of the column and thought about nothing in particular for a while. The ceremony started. I could hear it, the music, the officiant's voice, the moment the crowd laughed softly at something Colin said during his vows. I couldn't see much of it. When the applause came at the end, the couple at my table stood and craned their necks, and I stood too, out of reflex, and caught about 2 seconds of Colin and Beth walking back up the aisle before the column blocked them again. My father was seated in the third row on the left side. I know because I saw him when I came in. He saw me too. He waved, the kind of wave that means I see you, not the kind that means come here. Dinner was served at round tables, and mine was on the outer edge of the room's orbit. The couple from Beth's old job were kind enough people. We talked about nothing in particular, the weather, the drive, the food. The older relative of the caterer fell asleep between the salad and the main course, and I respected that choice enormously. At some point during the main course, my father made his way around the room doing the rounds of important tables, the ones with family friends and longtime colleagues, and people whose names he said loudly with both hands extended. He did not come to table 11. I watched him stop at table 4, table 6, table 7, and then turn back toward the head table, and I thought, there it is. There's the thing that is always there, made plain once more. That was the most humiliating part. Not the column. The column was an accident of room capacity. The rounds my father made were a choice, and choices reveal something that accidents don't. I cut my chicken and ate it, and didn't let my face do anything. What happened next is the part I've told and retold in my head many times since, testing whether I've remembered it correctly, whether I've added anything or softened anything. I don't think I have. I had gotten up to find the restroom, walking along the far wall, when I heard it. Captain Mercer? The voice was coming from the table I was passing. Table 8, I think. One of the nicer tables closer to the center of the room. I stopped and turned, and at first I wasn't sure who had spoken, because the man standing up from his chair didn't look the way he had the last time I'd seen him. Brigadier General Howard Slade was 71 years old and had retired from active duty 4 years prior. He put on a little weight, and his hair was fully white now, and he was wearing a dark suit instead of a uniform, and for about 2 full seconds my brain just didn't place him. Then it did. "Sir," I said, and my back straightened without my permission. He was laughing. A real laugh, low and surprised. "I thought that was you, the uniform." He extended his hand and I shook it, and he held my hand in both of his for a moment, the way people do when they're genuinely glad to see you. "How long has it been?" 4 years, sir. The transition ceremony. 4 years. He shook his head. "You look exactly the same." General Slade had been my commanding general during my second deployment. I'd had minimal direct interaction with him. I was a captain, he was a general. We did not exactly run in the same circles, but there had been an incident involving a logistics failure and a bridge assessment, and a decision I'd made alone in the field that had, apparently, been briefed up the chain in enough detail that he knew my name when he saw it. He called me into his office afterward and asked me to walk him through my thinking. We'd talked for 40 minutes. He'd shaken my hand on the way out and said something I've never repeated to anyone because it felt too private. Now he was standing at table 8 at my brother's wedding because his wife was a college friend of Beth's mother. "What are you doing way over there?" he asked, nodding toward my table. I opened my mouth to say something neutral, but something in my face must have answered the question before I did, because he glanced at table 11 and then back at me, and something in his expression shifted. "Come sit with us," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Sir, I don't want to—" "Captain Mercer." He said my name the way commanding officers say names when they've made a decision. "Sit down." I sat down at table 8. His wife was gracious and warm and asked good questions and listened to the answers. The other couple at the table were a physician from Boston and her husband, who turned out to be a former Army Ranger, and we spent 20 minutes talking about infrastructure in forward operating environments. And I felt, for the first time that entire day, like a person with a full interior life. General Slade did not ask about my family or how I'd ended up at table 11. He just talked to me the way he always had, directly, with genuine interest, as if the answer to whatever he was asking actually mattered to him. At one point he said quietly to the table, "You know, she once made a field call that probably saved 11 lives and never put it in the report. Asked me not to make a big deal of it." I didn't know what to do with that, so I just looked at my plate. At some point during dessert, the MC announced that a few people had requested to say a few words before the evening wrapped up. It was casual, a few toasts, the kind that happen after the official ones, when people feel sentimental. General Slade stood up. The room quieted in the way that rooms quiet when someone with a particular kind of gravity gets to their feet. He was in civilian clothes, but it didn't matter. That quality doesn't come from the uniform. He said he'd only recently met the groom's family, but that he had known the groom's sister for several years. He said that he had, in his career, served alongside thousands of people, and that the ones he remembered most were not the ones who were loudest or who sought the most recognition, but the ones who did the right thing in hard circumstances because it was the right thing, and who then sat down quietly and went back to work. He said he was glad she was there that night. He looked at me when he said it. The room was not large enough that this went unnoticed. People turned to see who he was looking at. The couple from Beth's old job at table 11 turned too. Confused. The MC looked uncertain. Beth was smiling, a little surprised, and my father at table 3 had gone very still. I don't know exactly what he was thinking. I have never asked him, and he has never volunteered it. I know what his face looked like because I could see it from where I was sitting. He was no longer doing the easy social smile he'd been wearing all evening. He was looking at me the way you look at something you're seeing for the first time, even though it's been in the room with you all along. My mother pressed her hand briefly to her mouth. Colin caught my eye from the head table and gave me a look I didn't entirely know how to read. Part surprise, part something that might have been pride, part something older and more complicated that I think had to do with all the years we'd spent in the same house not quite understanding each other. I nodded at General Slade. It was all I could manage. He sat back down and picked up his water glass and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Excellent cake," and that was that. The evening wound down the way evenings do. People hugged and gathered coats and said their goodbyes. At some point, my father made his way over to where I was standing near the exit. We hadn't had a real conversation in probably 3 months. He stood next to me for a moment and didn't say anything. I didn't say anything either. We watched Colin and Beth make the rounds, laughing, glowing, exactly as happy as they deserved to be. Finally, my father said, "I didn't know he knew you." "Yes, sir," I said, because old habits. He was quiet for another moment. "You never told us," he said, not accusing. "Something quieter than that." "You didn't ask," I said. I kept my voice even. I wasn't punishing him with it, it was just true. He nodded slowly and I let him nod, and then Colin appeared between us and grabbed us both by the shoulder and said something about cake, and the moment closed over itself the way moments do. I drove back to my motel that night and sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the dark. Here is what I know about families. They build their narratives early and they maintain them with tremendous energy, because change requires everyone to admit that the story they were telling was incomplete. It is easier to keep the old story. It requires less from everyone. Here is what else I know. I didn't need my father to stand up in that ballroom and declare anything. I didn't need a revised seating arrangement or a retroactive apology or a conversation where he said the things he hadn't said for 30 years. The need I had was smaller and more specific than that. I needed to stop being invisible in a room where I was supposed to belong. General Slade gave me that, not on purpose or not entirely. He did it because that's how he was. He saw people clearly and he said what he saw, and he didn't make a production of it. He had been doing that his whole career. That night, it just happened to be aimed at me. I went back to work the following Monday. I got on a call at 7 a.m. about a project I can't name in a location I can't specify, and I solved a problem no one else had been able to solve. And then I ate lunch at my desk and answered emails and forgot for a while about the column and the seating chart and my father's still face. That's the shape of my life mostly. It doesn't always look like much from the outside. Some things only make sense from certain angles, and some rooms have columns in them, and sometimes the only way out from behind one is to sit very still until someone who knows your name walks past. I'm still sitting here, still plugging away, as my old commander used to say. There are worse things to be. I've thought about that evening more times than I can count, and the thing that stays with me isn't the column, or the seating chart, or even what General Slade said when he stood up. What stays with me is my father's face in the moment after. That stillness, like something had shifted and he was waiting to find out what. Here's what I've come to understand about that. The way people see you is almost always a story they told themselves a long time ago, and they defend that story not because it's true, but because changing it costs something. My father had a version of me that was built in pieces over decades. The daughter who left, who chose something hard and far away, who never explained herself enough. That version was easier to shelve than to examine, and I let him keep it, partly because I didn't know how to hand him a different one, and partly because I was tired of asking to be seen by someone who should have been looking without being asked. What I know about cause and effect, not in any mystical sense, just the plain human kind, is that the things we quietly do accumulate, not always in ways that get noticed, not always on any timeline that feels fair, but they accumulate. Every decision I made in that field, every hour I put in without recognition, every time I did the right thing in a hard circumstance and then sat back down without making it about myself, those things were real. They existed whether or not my family knew about them. General Slade knew about them because he had been there, because he had paid attention, because that was the kind of person he was. And when he stood up in that ballroom, what he was really doing was making visible something that had always been true. I don't think you can manufacture that. You can perform your way into the kind of recognition that actually means something. People who have been around long enough, who have seen enough, they can tell the difference between someone who is genuinely capable and someone who is working very hard to appear that way. What I'd built over years I often felt were going unwitnessed, turned out to have been witnessed by exactly the right person at exactly the right time. I don't call that luck. I call that the natural result of deciding, early on, that the work was worth doing whether anyone was watching or not. The part about my father, I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn that into a victory, and it wasn't. It was just a moment of honesty between two people who had been circling each other for a long time. He said he didn't know, and that was true. And it was also a choice that had been made over and over across years of Sunday phone calls and family dinners and engagement parties where no one asked a follow-up question. But I also think about what it takes to stand next to your child and say, quietly, I didn't know, and mean it not as an excuse but as the beginning of something. That takes a kind of courage that doesn't get talked about enough. The courage to admit that your story was incomplete. I don't have a clean resolution to offer. My father and I are still learning how to talk to each other. It's slow and imperfect, and sometimes I drive home from visits feeling like we got close and then didn't. But the column is gone. That much I know. Whatever room we're in now, I'm not behind anything.